Welcome to the Carey Nieuwhof Leadership Podcast. I hope this episode helps you thrive in life and leadership. And if you like it, hit the like button and subscribe to my channel, and that way you'll never miss a thing. Well, if you're like me, you're always looking for ways to stay informed and engaged with the world around us. And that's why I created On the Rise. It's a curated weekly newsletter packed with thought-provoking articles and insights on faith, culture, and the future of the church, and really any other subject that I find fascinating and conversation worthy. And I send it to you absolutely free every single week. So if you're ready to join the conversation and be part of a community of curious, engaged leaders, you can subscribe to On the Rise today at ontherisenewsletter.com. You can start and stop at any point on ontherisenewsletter.com. This episode is also presented by Glue. Glue is connecting the faith ecosystem in innovative ways. One way is by making it a lot easier for churches to connect with new visitors. Did you know, for example, that the time it takes for a church to respond to new visitors has a major impact on whether that new person or family will stay? Well, with Glue, you can use automation to build engaging new visitor engagement journeys. You can learn how at get.glue.us/visitors. That's get.glue.us/visitors. And now to today's episode. Well, Peter and Chris, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, great to be here.
Yeah. So Rooting for Rivals, I saw the book. One of you sent me a card and a note in the book. Isn't that right? Was that you, Peter?
That was me. Yep. I've
Thank
been
you so
a
much for that.
long-time listener of the podcast, and you made some comments that related to some of the themes. So thanks for reading it. It means so much.
Well, it's a needed, talked about subject. And the book came out a few years ago, but I think it's only gotten worse maybe over the last few years. Rivalry has become more intense, less cooperation, more competition. So you diagnose, I want to start here. You diagnose a rival as a peer, P-E-E-R, appearing to compete for staff, funding, or recognition. So you guys have been involved in a nonprofit for years. So it could be, our competition is other nonprofits. Businesses see other businesses as competitors. Believe it or not, if you're in the church, you know this, no surprise. Churches see churches across town as competitors, right? That's what you're talking about. How does that set us up for natural competition? Like when you think about it, why do so many of us go there saying, I'm competing with the growing church down the road, or I'm competing with this church that's stealing our people? Why do you think that seems to happen in almost every industry and field?
I think this topic of rivalry is nothing new. I do appreciate you say that it's, maybe it feels more acute right now, but even in the opening pages of Scripture, we see Cain and Abel, sibling rivalry. It starts a long time ago and it continues today. This idea that there is not enough to go around. And so we see the other, especially those that are closest to us, as a threat. And you're exactly right. Oftentimes we don't compare ourselves with individuals or organizations that are so far removed or in a different sector. Oftentimes it's organizations that are closest. And I believe at its root, it really is this worldview of scarcity. There's not enough to go around. There's not enough funding. There's not enough staff. There's not enough resources. And so we identify other organizations as the competition. Here is our team. That is their team. And that is who we are competing against. And we believe that is a common but fundamentally flawed way of viewing other organizations.
Chris, what's your take on that?
Yeah, it is as old as time. It's evident, as Peter said, with Cain and Abel. You look at Jesus' disciples, you look at the early church, you look at the history of our tradition, the Protestant tradition, protest is in our name. So there's this dynamic of we see challenges and issues within our institutions and we blow them up and we build new ones and we split and we divide. And we're not arguing in the book that every rival or every, peer organization should merge into one. What we are arguing is that we could do a lot better of working together and recognizing the respective gifts and strengths of organizations that we don't work within or the churches that we don't attend. And in doing so, I believe we can create a better witness for the gospel in culture at large.
I'd love you to share, because you tell some stories in the book about rivalries and competitive tactics that you've actually seen in ministry. So feel free to pull from the horror show files if you want, but like it does get pretty bad at times.
Well, I think, oftentimes when you look at others, it is perhaps easier to see ways that they have had an unhealthy view of competition. But really, as we explored this, I mean, these were issues that we were feeling. And Carey, I went so far as to have a little graph on my wall right here next to me. And it was a graph of the growth rates of Hope International. And who did I compare myself against? It was other nonprofits in the space. And I would measure how well we are doing based on the relative growth towards others. And that just does crazy things. It does crazy things when we identify these other peer organizations as our competition. It either leads to an inflated sense of pride. Look at us. We're growing really fast right now compared to the others. Or what are we doing wrong? As opposed to a different question, how are we doing with the resources and opportunities that God has given us right now in this moment? I guess maybe the first horror show is when we looked in the mirror and saw that we had some unhealthy things in our own life, in our own leadership. But then perhaps the most acute example that I did see was when we released a devotional that was built around a question that God asked Moses of what's in your hands. And it was really a devotional talking about how oftentimes God uses what he's already entrusted to us in doing the miraculous. And as we launched this video, there was another nonprofit that reached out and said, Peter, you got to stop using that video. And the reason was because they said, we have trademarked Exodus 4:2. We had trademarked those words. And I guess two questions in there, Carey. One, I didn't even think it was possible that you could have a trademark on a Bible verse. And turns out they had filed for it. But the second question is, why would we do that? And I think that when we view other organizations as our competition, we hold on with tight fists to things that really are not even ours to hold on to. But to be fair, a few months later, there was a third organization that used that verse in a similar way. And I remember reaching out to Chris and saying, Chris, they're using our verse on that. And I think it was at that moment that Chris helped me see there was a giant log protruding from my eye that I better pay attention to on this verse. But how easy it is for all of us to hold on to things, especially when it is rooted in a belief of scarcity, how easy it is to hold on to things that really should be held with open hands.
Chris, what's your take on that? What are some of the things that you've seen? And feel free to share some examples. Yeah, that one's pretty extreme. Like actually, I love that trademarking a verse from the book of Exodus. It's like, yeah, I don't think you can do that. I'm not sure that's going to stand up in eternity, but.
I mean, there are the personal examples which we talk about. I mean, ultimately, as leaders and staff members at faith-based nonprofits, we have our own battle, to fight on this front. But then institutionally, I think we also saw some really jarring examples within our own sector in the Christian relief and development organizations, but also within the Bible translation movement. One of our friends shared a really striking example from his foundation, where he shared that 3 different Bible translation organizations approached him asking for money, and they each were asking for funds to fund the translation for the exact same language for the same people group. And the thing that was striking to him when he went back to them and said, hey, do you know these other organizations are also working on the same translation? They had no idea. And again, that wasn't insidious. It wasn't that they were trying to kind of fight against these nonprofits. They're just so focused on their own work and their own project, they're missing the fact that there are other organizations, peers, friends out there, brothers and sisters in Christ who are doing the exact same work at the exact same time, and they were totally unaware of it. And so that example, I think, we'll maybe get into more of kind of how that came full circle. But I think that those realities are true in every sector in the work that we're doing right now of organizations just being so focused on building their own little, their own little kingdom that they miss the big K kingdom.
Well, I wonder if some of that is a natural evolution of where we've come as a culture. So, for example, you go through any town or village or city in America or Canada, and you'll see an Anglican church, Presbyterian church, United Church, United Methodist Church right across the street from each other. Very normal. And then sometimes a Baptist church or Pentecostal church, more on the edge of town, etc. And it made a lot of sense because you didn't have connectivity. Like if you're going to go to a Presbyterian church, you had to be within walking or soon driving distance. And so it would be natural that you're cooperating with other Presbyterian churches, but like you're the only game in town, you're the only hot dog stand in town. Now, all of a sudden, we have much greater mobility, we've got much greater awareness. Do you think some of that is at play? Think about Bible translation societies. Yeah, 50 years ago, you could potentially, because you just didn't know, have 3 translators in Haiti working on the same translation and you be unaware of it. Do you think some of that is technology and we just haven't caught up? Or do you think it's more malevolent than that?
Yeah, Carey, here in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, where I live, it's really interesting to look at. When I moved here, I thought that there was the Amish. And anytime you see a horse and buggy, I guess I thought that was all part of one, but you can actually trace the history back. And I think there is this history of, it is one organization, one group of individuals, and then a difference of opinion and a split happens and another split. And now there are multiple different branches within this broader community.
Say more about that, because those of us who don't know Amish culture as well, I think are shocked. Like that went on for a few pages in the book, and just tell some of the distinctions. Like it's crazy.
Right. Well, I mean, you actually can tell some of the differences. They have chosen to paint their buggies a different color. So you can actually, if you're looking carefully enough, you can tell even the different type of the Amish or Old Order Mennonite based on the color that they use on their buggy, as if to say, we're not quite like them. There is a difference. And some of the splits have happened over some maybe significant theological differences, but some of the splits happened over what I would say are some pretty minor differences about certain aspects of clothing and the use of buttons versus zippers. And believe it or not, there have been splits over perhaps less significant issues than that. So I think there's something in us, and this is not to point to the Amish or Old Order Mennonite. I think it's actually just to recognize that if we're not careful, we can very easily look at others and need to have some sort of validation by saying, we're different, we're not like them. And that leads to splinter, it leads to factions. And really what we're seeing is, but what if? What if we could rediscover a shared mission that was beyond any organization? What if we could rediscover a bigger and more compelling mission to go after? And instead of focusing on those minor differences, what if we had clarity about what is most important and then had some pretty creative partnership in pursuit of that? So to think beyond our smaller differences and maybe to rediscover what we do have in common. We think that is where the movements are happening in our time, in our day. And that's what we want to be a part of. We want to be a part of not just building a smaller organization, but being part of a mission that would be impossible for any one organization to accomplish on its own. A mission that requires us to have some creative alliances with individuals that are pursuing that goal together. And again, there's so many great examples right now in our time of that type of movements that are happening.
So, Chris, I want to bounce a theory off of you. This is one I developed a few years ago. So I'm in Canada. We have a tiny splinter of the population that's going to show up in church this weekend, less than 10%. And that's just the way it's been here for a while. My theory is this, and feel free to disagree. You don't have to be polite. When Christians are in the majority in a culture where most people are Christians, we define ourselves by our differences. Mm-hmm. And so we say, this is how we do baptism. That's how you do it. We're buttons, not zippers, right? So it's sort of, I've got to distinguish myself from you. Because everyone's going to church, I just have to say why we're different. When Christians form a minority in culture, in a place like Canada, in a place like Europe, Australia, New Zealand, and many other places around the world, I think we're united by our commonalities, not our differences. And so I kind of grew up doing ministry going, okay, Jesus, Bible, prayer, you believe in those things? Awesome. We're friends, not rivals. Do you think there's a difference between majority and minority culture? Because America is very quickly moving from majority to minority culture, which is one of the reasons I wanted to have this conversation. What's your thoughts on that, Chris?
I agree completely. I mean, I've even seen it where I grew up in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. It is a majority Christian culture. And I did feel that there was a really intense perspective on this church versus that church and what they believe and what they believe. Being in Colorado, where it's like, last I saw, less than 5% of people go to church on a Sunday morning or are regularly a part of a church. There is, I think, a spirit of kind of surprise even when you see someone out at a church or your church that is a fellow Christian that you know from school or something else, and you're like, wow, you go to church, that's amazing, and you go to a different church than me, that's great. It's a very different perspective here than even where I grew up, which was more like the Bible Belt, I'd argue, than here. And so we make the same argument in the book that the kind of the cultural winds right now in the United States in particular, I think are creating an opportunity for the American church specifically to learn from the Canadian church, to learn from churches in places where the church is a minority, and begin to work together more effectively and not operate from this kind of 50-year-old viewpoint. And the Pew Trust is one of the most reputable polling and data companies here in the U.S., and they've been looking at Americans' view of the church over the last 5 decades and assessing America's level of trust in the church. And when they started doing this study specifically on the church about 40 years ago, the percentage of Americans who highly distrusted the church and organized religion was at 7%. And today it's over 21%. So it's tripled. So the percentage of our neighbors that highly distrust us as a church has tripled over the last 4 decades. And the same thing has happened on the flip for those that highly trust us. So it went from like 45% down to 20%. So overcut in half our neighbors that are highly trusting of us. So we've got an increasingly suspicious, distrustful reality of the church from our neighbors. And this is certainly in some ways discouraging. I think in many ways brought this on ourselves. But it also is an opportunity, as you say. It's an opportunity to say, what are we ultimately about? What are the things, what are our hills to die on? And then even in that place of difference, and we're not saying uniformity is what we're going for, but how can we walk out in unity alongside our brothers and sisters in the faith, even if they believe something differently than us about zippers or differently than us, about baptism?
Peter, what's your take? Any thoughts on moving from a majority to a minority culture?
So Chris and I work for Hope International. So we work in 23 countries around the world. And we have both experienced what it looks like to show up in minority cultures and contexts. And when I was in Afghanistan, there were not multiple choices of where to go to church. There was one. And similar when we have traveled throughout different countries in Asia, there are not a lot of choices. And there is this element of it does force you to come together. And I guess, yeah, as you said, that there's an upside on that. There's a beauty of that. And I think about John chapter 17, and the last and longest recorded prayer of Jesus was for us. He prays for those who believe in his name. So anyone who is a follower of Jesus, Jesus was praying for us the night before he went to the cross. And the prayer is specific. And the prayer is that we would be brought to complete unity. And it says, then the world will know that you have sent me. So there's something about our witness to the world that hinges on this issue. So we would argue that this is not just a nice issue like, hey, we can accomplish a little bit more if we figure out how to get over our petty rivalries. We would say this is central to our witness to the world. And maybe what Chris just shared about the data about decreasing trust, maybe there's a connection. When the world sees division all around it, and they look at the church and they see that same level of division, I think they have a good reason to be skeptical of whether or not we actually do have the most important thing in common. And so I guess that's really what animates us, of how do we live into that prayer that Jesus had in John chapter 17? How do we figure out how to the most gracious approach to each other and maybe rediscover a spirit not of rivalry, but a spirit of friendship as we pursue bigger and better and bolder goals than we ever could accomplish on our own.
I'd love to talk to you about abundance versus scarcity thinking, because you raised it already. I think that's a huge issue. It's a issue in life. Talk about abundance versus scarcity. Maybe we'll start with this. Why do so many people, what is the psychology behind scarcity thinking?
Well, I'll tell you, it's really woven deeply into who we are as humans. I see it with my 4 young kids almost every day, where, that one marker of the 75 that are in the bin is the marker that's creating, this incredible scene in my home. And there are 74 other markers. And in fact, that marker is going to be back in that bin in about 8 minutes. And yet it's like we just cling to that thing that we just desperately want it. We desperately need it. And I think as leaders, it's the water that we swim in, and it's so hard to get away from scarcity thinking. I remember being a new fundraiser with Hope back in 2010. And so I had this opportunity to go and pitch Hope International to a group of really prominent business people and pastors at one of the largest churches. I think at that time it was the largest church in Colorado. And so this felt like this moment for me. Like I'm going to get a chance to go and tell everyone at this, breakfast why Hope International is the very best nonprofit that they could give to, the most efficient. And so I had my standard Hope presentation, and then I added this last slide on my PowerPoint deck that compared Hope to really amazing organizations like International Justice Mission, Compassion International, Healing Waters, these organizations that are doing incredible work. But I looked at how many people you can serve per dollar over the course of a year using really crass data from annual reports. And I charted Hope versus all of these other organizations. And as you might imagine, Hope came out like the bargain winner in that comparison. And so we were the clear, if you care about, efficiency and you want to make sure your dollar goes farthest, you should give to Hope International. So I give the pitch. I'm like, hey, listen, these organizations are awesome. You'll spend a lot more to minister to one person in a year than you would if you give to Hope, but you do you. Whatever you feel called to is awesome. And then opened it up for Q&A at the end of the presentation. And one of the pastors that was in the audience said, hey, that last slide, it was it felt like an apples to oranges comparison. I mean, you're doing very fundamentally different things. And that just felt kind of strange that you would kind of compare Hope to these other organizations. And it was this really humbling moment of recognizing that, it was like Peter talked about earlier, of looking in the mirror and seeing your own scarcity thinking of this was my chance. If I don't put down all of these other organizations that are by the way, closing down brothels, changing laws in countries about trafficking, helping children to meet Jesus and be in a supportive community of friends. I mean, if I have to put that down in order to talk about Hope, I mean, what an absolute tragedy of a sinful heart. And so I was so glad that pastor, and I still know him, Dave, good guy. I'm so glad he had the courage to sort of call me out in front of this group because it was the sort of the mirror that I needed to recognize that that's not how I want to go about fundraising for this organization. I can fundraise for Hope in a way that elevates the incredible work God's doing through Hope and celebrates the incredible ways in which other ministries around us are enabling Hope's work to thrive. We need to be working alongside them. We shouldn't be working in competition with them. We should be arm in arm with them. Thankfully, we've grown a lot in that, I think in large measure because of recognizing there's just no life in that area of scarcity thinking. There's just no life. It makes us feel gross.
Peter, I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about scarcity thinking. So in the scenario that Chris raised, you have pastors sitting there. And I know I'm just speaking on behalf of a friend. I'm not saying I've ever had these thoughts when I led a church, but there is this natural, and I love how you're saying it's just natural to think scarcity, that, hey, if I let Hope International into my church, that means less money for me, right? So a lot of pastors and a lot of leaders of organizations get very protective of, well, if I'm running a restaurant, but I talk about other restaurants, I'm going to lose business. If I'm running an auto repair store, garage, and I talk about another guy who does transmissions better, I'm going to lose business. If I'm a landscaper, I talk about other landscapers, I'm going to lose business. And so there's this scarcity mentality when it comes to, well, your first 10% has to be to our church. And then if you want to give over and above, you can give to other causes like hope or compassion, etc. What are your thoughts about that kind of scarcity mentality?
Yeah, and I love what Chris said, that there's no joy when we become obsessed with comparison. Mark Twain said that. He said, it is the death of joy. That is true, and that is what we have experienced. And the opposite is actually true as well, that there is a energy, there is a refreshment, there is an excitement when we can think beyond just the bounds of our organization. But I think it fundamentally comes down to bad math, Carey. Like, what do we actually believe? If we've got a community of individuals and we have an individual that leaves our church but goes to the other church and is so animated by that other church that they invite 4 of their friends, what's our math? Is our math -1 or is it +4? And I think too often we just have bad math because we do not think beyond the bounds of our organization. And I think you're totally right. Fundraising is where we feel this most acutely. We think there are limited resources. And I so appreciate, Chris was talking about IJM, but Melissa Russell was leading their fundraising team. And I so appreciated her perspective that when the Ice Bucket Challenge was happening, a friend came to her and said, Melissa, I wish all of this attention was for you and IJM. And in a world of scarcity, that makes sense, right? If people are paying attention to this other cause, that means there's less attention for the good work of IJM. But she kind of turned that on its head and said, imagine if you had a family member that you loved that was dealing with ALS. Imagine how it would feel right now when the world is paying attention. And that moment does not take away from a broader movement of the ability to get excited about a broader movement of generosity. And then she said this that I'll never forget. She said, I believe in a God that took 5 loaves and 2 fish and fed the multitudes. And my favorite part of that story is that there was a basket full of leftovers for every single one of the disciples as a giant exclamation point of, guess what? God's got enough. God has absolutely enough. So I think maybe it's a little bit rooted in, maybe we need to think beyond just a fixed pie. Maybe we need to think about a God of abundance that can do abundantly more than we could ask or imagine. And then maybe just one additional thought in that is, if we're going to be competitive about anything, let's be competitive with the fact that as a percent of GDP, giving in the United States has been static at around 2% for the last 50 years. There has been no movement in the broader percentage that we give. So what's going to happen if we actually collectively say, let's move the needle on that. Let's move the needle on the broader generosity movement. Let's go from 2% to 4%. And guess what happens? Then there is more than enough for all of us. And I believe that sort of bigger vision is going to attract more individuals to want to be part. And it's going to expand that amount of resources for all of us when we start tearing down each other and start casting bigger visions, broader visions that require some creative collaboration.
So 2 things. One, I did the Ice Bucket Challenge. That was almost 10 years ago. And until you mentioned it, I was struggling to remember who on earth was that on behalf of. Like, I don't even remember. I just remember the Ice Bucket Challenge. It was one of the first viral things that happened, on social media to raise money for charity. So there's that. And then second, talk to the leader who says, hey, I need to raise $3 million a year for my organization. If I start profiling you, that's going to cut into what I take. Now, you've got all kinds of examples in your work that show the opposite, but speak directly to that leader and say, think again, your math is bad. Scarcity thinking leads to dwindling resources. Abundance thinking leads to expanding resources. Some of the people are going to need data. So help them see it. What would you say to that leader?
Well, I'm not sure this data can be applied to financial giving, but I will say, every Giving Tuesday for probably the last 7 or 8 years, Hope International has given away our platform. And so we recommend 5 other organizations that, our donor base, those that subscribe to Hope, should give to. And so we just started doing that. Like, here are organizations that we love. Sometimes it's organizations we're working with. Sometimes they're just organizations that we think are great. And it is our most opened email, most clicked email, most feedback email that we send out every year, like for the last 8 years. So that's one little data point of how countercultural it is to operate that way as a nonprofit that also needs to raise money, and also Giving Tuesday is a great day to raise money. And it's such a small thing that we do, but it is so surprising to our community of supporters because it's just not something that many nonprofits do. And so I would suggest that when we think about specifically fundraising and that leader that needs to raise $3 million, the first thing I would say, and it sounds so simple, but I think for fundraisers, it's really important that we remember this, that there are no donors that are our donors. There are no donors whose money is our money. And so I think a lot of times we operate in the way we conduct our fundraising like we have power over another individual and over the way that they give. And in fact, we don't. We can invite, we can cast the net, we can extend an invitation, but ultimately we are not the ones that are writing the check, that are sending the pledge and making the gift. And when we can believe that, then we start to ask the question, if it's not our donor and it's not our money, then how in the midst of that truth would we want someone to approach us and invite us to get involved in their organization? And I think we've all been a part of organizations that will not relent in their solicitation. They will not relent in the mailers they're sending us, the desperation, the scarcity, the ways in which things are, give now or children are going to die, like give now or people are going to starve. Like it makes us feel guilty and shameful because we aren't getting involved. And we can write a go away, like appease my guilt check, but we're not going to give in a transformative and generous and excited way to a cause that's raising money like that. Now, I'm using an extreme of kind of an abundance and scarcity, like the children will die if you don't give today. But I would say most nonprofits still lean toward that posture of urgency and that posture of desperation that I would say really runs counter to what Jesus calls us to in thinking about raising money. I mean, the story of the loaves and the fishes, we look at kind of all of Scripture, even going back to the Old Testament and the offerings, when the church was at its best, money wasn't an issue. The generosity from God's people came out of that place of trust in God and trust in God that he's going to meet our needs. And that might mean that our budget shrinks some years. I'm not making the case like prosperity gospel, like you start abundance fundraising, then your budget's going to grow every year. It might be that you don't need, like that your budget doesn't need to grow. It might mean that you have to shrink for a season. But operating from a place of abundance and God's big K kingdom, I would argue, is the obedient thing to do. And so it's not really a matter of like, will it work or won't it work? I really think it's a matter of either following God's prescription for how we should raise money or disobeying it.
So I want to get Peter's take on what he would say to the person who's just gripped by scarcity thinking. But before we get there, I got to ask the Machiavellian question, which is, so when you send that email on Giving Tuesday, does anybody donate to your cause? What happens?
That's a good question. Peter, do you know the data on that?
Carey, I thought you were going to ask a different question. Does anyone actually follow up and donate to the other organizations? And that I can answer definitively, yes. We know lots of times that individuals support these other organizations. So the answer is yes to that. Do people give to Hope on that day? I would say probably not. Do people end up giving more over time because they see us as an organization that is not relentlessly pursuing its own good and has a vision that is beyond just what we can do? Absolutely on that. So I would say probably lower on that day, but I think longer term, it results in greater level of trust. And unfortunately, it sets us apart. It's an uncommon aspect of Hope that we really do try to do everything possible to say, let's regularly, routinely think beyond. And while that's an example of fundraising, I think the same principle applies with our staff prayer times. Regularly, are we praying for other organizations that are within our sector, within our space? Regularly, are we being generous with the way that we are open sourcing information that might be helpful to other organizations? Yes. And what happens in those moments? Relationships deepen with these other organizations, creative partnerships happen, and I would say there is an acceleration of the good that we're able to do as a result.
I appreciate you thought I was going to ask a different question. I see it as my job to ask the question that honestly, a lot of people are thinking and no one has the courage to ask in real life. So it's like I get to have a fun conversation and ask the awkward, perhaps sinful question. So yeah, thank you for the answer. And I think you're right. And intuitively, it's like, oh yeah, I'm going to give to these guys today. But then you remember hope and perhaps it comes back to you. So again, Peter, talk the scarcity, because an abundance mindset is something I want to embrace in my life. And I've been working on it for decades. I'm not saying I'm there. I'm just working on it. Talk to the person who's still stuck in scarcity thinking. How do you talk that leader off of his or her cliff?
Yeah, I guess I would maybe be super pragmatic and just say, try it. Try it. And see if, as a result, you have more joy. See if you have deeper relationships with others. See if you feel like a little bit of a lightening of the oppressive way of every conversation has to be somehow bent back to yourself. That's not life. That's not relationship. That's there's no joy in that. We have this one line, give yourself the gift of getting over yourself. And maybe that's part of this, is just like have the fun of actually not thinking about every conversation in what is there for you. And then have this broader piece of saying, and what are the resources that are entrusted to us in this moment of time? And how do we maximize the good? Again, our experience, not just with Hope, but with other organizations, is absolutely in a line. I love the Proverbs 11:25, but it just says, whoever refreshes others will be refreshed. And that is absolutely what we've experienced as we have grown in our generosity to other organizations and having a more charitable mindset to our peers. I would say there is more energy, there is more vision, there are deeper relationships with others. And again, the ultimate outcome is there are more people that are being served through Hope in these other organizations. There is more good that is being done around the world. And so we just get excited. So for the person that maybe is having a hard time, I would just say, try it.
I think
try it.
And I think practically, as leaders of faith-based nonprofits, one of the things we've observed is that it takes practice and discipline to actually do this. You know, having participated in a lot of sales and fundraising training over the years, whenever you're meeting with a donor or potential donor, it almost always happens that early in the conversation, they start making the connection between the work they're hearing about at Hope and these other international ministries that their church is involved in or that they've been giving to forever. And so they start sharing about these other causes. And they start talking about clean water and how they've been involved with clean water and why it's so important in Congo. And as a fundraiser, the training is redirect. I see that you're interested in Congo. Hope International also operates in Congo. And then you segue beautifully, into your pitch. And I think that the opportunity is in that moment is to actually be present and curious with that person and say, like, how did your church get involved in clean water in Congo? And just keep exploring and learning more and growing in sort of your own understanding of the issue. And why does clean water in Congo, why is this specific church involved there? And how did that become an issue? And are there any organizations doing great work there? And what are they? And should we be connecting with them? And should we be telling others about them? And, that self-forgetfulness, both for us individually and for organizations, I think ultimately leads to just more joyful conversation. It leads to that individual feeling really heard and known. And I think ultimately that's what we're called to. And so I think it's kind of getting off our own track and just being really present in that moment. And in this age that we live in, with the clutter and the busyness and the kind of messages always coming in at us, I think providing the gift of being present to someone and listening to them and truly being curious is really a sacred opportunity that we have. as Christians. So yeah, I would argue that it's difficult though, because it really runs against a lot of how we've been trained and wired in order to raise money, in order to represent a cause.
Well, and further evidence of that, just reread Dale Carnegie, How to Win Friends and Influence People. And the listener usually wins, right? If you're interested rather than being interesting, it's amazing what can happen. So I hear what you're saying, but I can also see, and I'm kind of unpacking objections here because I'm firmly in the abundance camp, but I also understand scarcity mindset. Some people are saying, well, maybe abundance thinking is for people who are affluent, because if you knew how tight it is around here, you knew how hard we fight for every dollar. You knew how close to the line we actually live, that if we lose 10%, we could go under, have to close the doors. So how do you maintain a posture of abundance when really you don't have a lot?
Carey, we might be the wrong people to ask that question. The work that we do brings us in relationship with the global church in places of extreme poverty. The core models that we use, individuals saving together, individuals investing in each other's businesses together. And we have seen community and generosity in places that would make anyone who is having that conversation maybe have a little bit of a pause to say that. So I guess I would push back a little bit on that. And yes, it might mean a change of plans. Yes, it might mean that we need to do things differently. But I just, do not believe that there is not going to be enough. And maybe there might be some additional creativity that will come. And how many organizations discovered significant changes that happened in the year 2020 when regular operations were disrupted? I can tell you from our vantage point, the answer is a lot. There is new innovation that happened when individuals said, this is a change in circumstance. Let's figure it out. And I think in a similar way, instead of just bemoaning the fact that we feel like, we don't have enough, I think to shift that question and say, well, here's what we do have. What's the way of maximizing the good of that? And real quickly having the forward momentum as opposed to just sitting back in a posture of, there's never enough for us to do. I think there's great innovation if we have eyes and vision and creativity to say, this is where we are. Let's make the most of it. And again, we are inspired regularly by the families that we serve around the world that model that generosity in abundance mindset is not tied to the real dollars that are involved.
Chris, any additional thoughts on that?
Yeah, I remember being in Rwanda and being in a group of individuals that were living on less than $4 a day in a savings group. And there was a woman that was in the community whose husband had just run out on her. And she came to this savings group knowing that this savings group was meeting. And she basically said, hey, I've got nothing. I need help. And the group members rallied at that meeting, came up with $60 in addition to a bag of beans and rice. And, I was just there as an American sort of observer, donor, supporter, staff member, watching it happen. I didn't, we weren't asked for money. It was just, she came to this community and they put together an incredible sum of money, which could have been used for their business. It could have been used to feed their children. It could have been used to pay for their school fees, to put a better roof on their house. You run through the list of the things that $60 and that food could have been used for. And again, I'm not in touch with that community today. It's been a long time. What happened? I don't know. But I would argue that's the obedient, faithful witness of the people of God. And that in God's mysterious, beautiful economy, as we operate that way, where we just say, we need to respond generously and open-handedly in this moment, God honors that. And he provides the daily bread, even in ways that don't seem intuitive.
I couldn't agree more. Haven't traveled as widely as you have, but I've spent quite a bit of time in Guatemala, some in Nicaragua. And in our work there, you're among the poorest of the poor, living on less than $1 a day. And the hospitality shown by them would embarrass most North Americans. I mean, they have almost nothing, but come into my house, stay if you want, let me prepare a meal, and they break out a feast. And you're thinking, my goodness, this could be 2 weeks worth of income for you to feed a slightly overweight Canadian. Like, what is going on here? And it's really, really humbling. And I love the direction you took with that. Second thing, and I think you referenced this in your work, but Craig Rochelle has said a pivot point at Life Church was they were struggling for resources. They didn't have enough margin. And back in 2006, they made a decision to open up Life Church Open and just give everything away. And then they built out YouVersion, and they have donors fund it. So you and I can open up the app. And he said that has blown the lid. Like, the very counterintuitive thing, we're going to give everything away, has blown the lid off generosity at Life Church. Are there other examples where you've seen pivots like that with Craig? And feel free to nuance it. You did the research. I just had a conversation, but that's as I remember it from Craig.
No, you're exactly right. And we were with Life Church, and they gave us a tour, and they showed us what they had done. And we came back from that, and we said, let's do the same thing. So we created a part of our website, and literally everything that we have is available for free. And there actually were some resources that we had jointly developed with another organization, but raised money to basically compensate the other organization so that we could make these resources available for free for anyone else that wanted to replicate the similar models. And we've experienced the exact same thing. That has opened up the doors to incredible, relationships. And then in a similar way, when we have, I remember early on in the pandemic, when we were trying to figure out how do we get messages to the places that we serve about what it looks like to respond well, Vision Fund was incredibly open-handed with us, saying these are some of the resources that we've developed. They were flip charts that we were able to very quickly use and get messages that truly were life-saving to the families that we serve around the world. And so we have both been a practitioner and a recipient of that sort of a posture of open-handedness. And what Life Church has done is inspiring. And we just think for any nonprofit that does not open source their materials, the question is, are they operating within their charter to not grow an organization, but to provide a good for the world or for the community? So we take a pretty what I hope is not a radical stance of saying, what if we all open sourced everything? What if there were no trademarks? I think that it would be an accelerant to the good work that's happening around the world.
Another big problem that you touch on is envy. Can you explain how you see envy surfacing and maybe why that seems to be such a persistent factor? Because, there's always someone who speaks better than you. There's always someone who's bigger than you. There's always someone who has more money than you. Envy is a very real thing. Talk to us about envy.
Well, I remember when I started at Hope. So I've been at Hope International for 17 years. And when I started Hope, we were the little guy. No one knew Hope International. We were, at that point, around a $5 million a year budget. Probably about 1,000 donors working in a few countries. And today, we're looked at by a lot of our peers as like a large organization, $36 million in funds raised, working in 20 plus countries. I think about 1,000 employees globally as part of the Hope International Global Network. And so over the course of the last 17 years, I've had this really interesting perspective of going from being a place where everyone else was bigger than Hope, it seemed like, and everyone else had less challenges and paid people more and had better benefits and, go through the list. And now at a point 17 years later where organizations are coming, visiting Hope to learn about how we grew and, how we operate. And it's still surprising me when I meet people and they know Hope International, the real one, because it's kind of a little bit of a bland name. I mean, there are a lot of Hopes in the world. And so I'm just I'm conditioned that when someone says, oh, I know Hope, I'm assuming that they know some other Hope. And in fact, a lot of times people actually know this Hope, the real Hope where we work. Yeah, not the real Hope. Sorry, that sounds cutting. They know the Hope that's real to me as an employee. And so I think that the journey of envy for the people of God is one where we first and foremost have to say, we live out of a response to our perfect Savior. So we live in response to the one who committed no sin. And so our envy should be like, how do we allow that perfection to permeate us a little bit more individually? And how would we allow the perfect nature of God to permeate our organizations a little bit more? And when we start comparing and looking across at that organization that's a little bit bigger, it's grown a little bit faster, or has a little bit more PR, they've gotten more celebrities to endorse them, they've gotten more big churches to come on board, we're really comparing ourselves to the wrong place. And our comparison should be in a healthy way to look at the glory of God and say, like, how beautiful it is that we serve this sacrificial, generous, abundance-minded creator savior. And out of that place, it's not like, we're not beating ourselves up for that, but we're recognizing that our goal is just to try and get out of the way. Our goal isn't to try and replicate these other organizations that are doing great work. It's just trying to let God's goodness in more than our nature is inhibiting God wanting to kind of break through us as individuals and our organizations.
Is this any way related to an earlier book the two of you co-wrote on mission drift? That can you see any tie-in? Because I can imagine scarcity thinking probably doesn't really have a super tight dialed-in mission with expansive thinking. Can you make a connection between the two and explain maybe as well, Peter, what you mean by mission drift?
Yeah. So, Chris and I, along with Anna Haggard, wrote Mission Drift, and really the goal of that was to say, over time, how do we make sure that we retain our focus on what matters most? Or as Stephen Covey says, how do we keep the main thing, the main thing, the main thing? How do we make sure we do not drift in our mission? And so we spoke to an incredible group of leaders around the world that have scaled and professionalized their own organizations and retained that core mission. And so we were trying to understand, what is it that they believe and what is it that they do? And I think you're absolutely right to make a connection, because in that book, we identify essentially 12 different ways that organizations can practice these behaviors we believe lead to a long-term faithful commitment to mission versus the counterfactual compared to organizations that have experienced drift. But I think as we looked at mission drift, we recognized that we actually missed out on a really important one. And it was the benefit of this laser focused on mission. The benefit of having that mission, when you know who you are, when you know what you're about, when you know what your organization is actively pursuing, you then start to look at other organizations and say, well, how do we partner together with them so that we can accomplish that mission better? How do we stay in our area of expertise, our area of focus, but then to be radically open-handed when we realize the mission that we are ultimately all about has got to be beyond just the work that we are doing. And I like how Simon Sinek in the Infinite Game, he really talks about the same idea, that when we think about just what's in it for us, that really is finite thinking. When he thinks about what is best for all of us, that's where movements happen. That's where there is an excitement. That's when there is real significant change that happens within a sector or industry. And so really rooting for rivals is taking, how do we stay what we discovered in Mission Drift, to stay focused on who we are, what we are about, and then to broaden that and say, and how do we pursue that together with other organizations that are also committed to a similar mission? Yeah, so it's been fun to pursue that. And maybe just as a parenthetical comment, I've loved the process of writing. Everything that we've written, Carey, is not because we have figured it out. We write as enthusiasts, not as expert. We write as people that then use it as an excuse to talk to incredible leaders around the world. And both Mission Drift and Rooting for Rivals, I would say, have expanded our ideas, have deepened our understanding of these concepts, and everything that we're sharing today is really gleaned from the conversations with a remarkable group of global leaders.
Well, I think that combination of a laser sharp mission, we know exactly what we're about, but we're open-handed, is a pretty irresistible. Because it's one thing to have, you're drifting all over the place, you don't even know what you are, and you're open-handed. Well, all right. But, we also know people who are laser focused and closed fisted And that's not great, but I think that's a pretty amazing combo. If you can be crystal clear about who you are, excited about the future, and open-handed and generous to others, that's incredible.
I remember,
Chris, any final thought? Go ahead.
I remember recently listening to a very popular podcast where a president of a large university was basically asked, is there any check too big? Is there any check that you couldn't put to work within your organization, or that you would say no to? Like, is there at any point where you'd be like, we aren't the best suited to take the money because someone else could do it better? And it was interesting because he said no. He said, we're the best, and it doesn't matter, what area that, the passion is of that funder. We can find a way to say yes to the largest check they could write. And I think that's the question for nonprofit leaders to really reckon with. And like, would you be willing if someone said, we could give you $10 million, or we could give you $100 million, or we could give you $1 billion? Like, what is your mission? And if you're unable to clarify, like, this is the territory and the terrain that God's called us to, and this is the work that we feel like we are uniquely positioned to address. And if you care about human trafficking, or you care about, children's health and nutrition, here are other organizations that are working on those issues, and give some of that $1 billion to them. Put some of that money to work outside of Hope International. Goodness. Like, we want to be organizations that say no to that answer, or to that question. I think that it's really easy to point a finger at someone that's like looking at like legitimately $1 billion checks. But when we look at our own kind of the conversations that we're having every day, it's hard to say, that's outside of our scope, or they do that better than we do. It's really difficult to even verbalize those words.
Any concluding thoughts? I love you tying in the infinite game to that too. Game theory is really fascinating, and permission to play again tomorrow. I love that idea. Right? This is an unending task. And I think those of us involved in causal work, causes that we care about, passion work, it's an infinite game. Any final thoughts as we wrap up?
Yeah, maybe just an invitation, Carey, which is oftentimes, like, it's easy to talk about these concepts, right? Abundance versus scarcity, or to talk about, is our commitment to the kingdom, or is it to our little club? And we just, in our leadership, we want to daily, not just in a book, but daily say, are we making decisions in light of an abundance mindset, and in light of something that is beyond us? And maybe the invitation is to say, take some small steps. Maybe for some individuals, it is going to be joining in, saying, I'm going to spend more time getting to know other leaders of other organizations. If you're a pastor in a community, I'm going to intentionally grow in relationship with other pastors in this community, and I'm going to show up at every single one of those meetings with one agenda item. How can I encourage this person that I'm meeting with? How can I become their biggest fan? Maybe for some, it is actually shifting in our prayer time. How often do we pray for those other organizations that we feel that twinge of envy that you were just talking about? And maybe for some of us, it's being generous to other peer organizations, knowing that where our money goes, there's a little piece of our heart. And are we generously supporting other organizations that are in our space that are also doing really good work? So I guess maybe the invitation would be, what is the one step to maybe grow towards a more rooting for rivals posture? Because I believe that there really is going to be refreshment and joy that's going to come when we have that posture. And then maybe the second comment is, and please be on the lookout for where you see this happening. We didn't have time in this podcast, Carey, to give the specific case studies. But even after the book came out, I have been so encouraged by examples of organizations collaborating together and saying, how do we clear the list of kids that are waiting to be in a safe home? How do we fundamentally rethink foster care so that every child has a home? That story that Chris told about Bible translation, they were on track to see the Bible translated into every language on earth by the year 2150. They're now on track to see that done by the year 2033. They've taken 117 years off of the pace of progress. And I could go on and on. So maybe there's a little more inspiration that would come. Look for those case studies of where you see individuals practicing the principles of rooting for rivals. And my guess is you are going to see accelerated impact, more joy, and the real movements of our day.
Well said. Well said. Yeah, that whole Bible translation thing, I'm familiar. I've had conversations with some of the people behind that. And to move from competition to cooperation has been transformative. And I think, to tie a bow on what we said earlier, when you move into a minority culture and the world's looking in John 17 prayer, non-Christians don't understand division. They don't understand why you think, I thought you guys were all Christians. Why aren't you? And it doesn't mean we have to completely all become totally one organization, but we need to cooperate. Chris, any final words from you? Final thoughts, challenge for leaders?
Well, I've spent some time talking about fundraising, and so I'll just maybe end there with practical steps. I mean, something that I've done historically and fellow fundraisers I've talked to over the years is that when we host fundraising events or banquets, breakfast gatherings, trips, our tendency is to group all the fundraisers from other organizations together and sort of keep fence them out from the other donors that are attending our event. And I think that there's an invitation for us to really flip our thinking on that and say, how do we instead be about inviting donors and fundraisers to sit alongside each other and get to know each other? And if someone comes to a Hope International event and they learn about International Justice Mission or Compassion or any number of great organizations that might be there, awesome. That's great news. That's great news for the kingdom. It's great news for the world. And so instead of, quarantining them to their own table, intersperse those fundraisers, get those other organizations in front of everyone that's there, because again, they're not our donors. And we want people to be exposed to how God's at work and not have a limited view. And I think we'll stay at that 2% or 2.3%, whatever the number is, of charitable giving if we operate from a place of scarcity.
Yeah. Well, the book we've mostly been talking about is called Rooting for Rivals. It's widely available everywhere. You also have Mission Drift. And tell me about the other book you wrote together. What's it called?
The Gift of Disillusionment.
Yes. We'll have to explore that some other time. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Peter, Chris, thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks, Carey.
Thank you, Carey.